Chapter 6. Look more closely at the signposts. "Holmes," I cried, "this is impossible." "Admirable," he said, "a most illuminating remark. It is impossible, as I state it, and therefore I must in some respect have stated it wrong. Yet you saw for yourself. Can you suggest any fallacy?" What kind of unity? Fortunately, there is a good bit more to be read into the unity of biochemistry than that all organisms on the earth share a set of molecules. There is plenty of small print to be scrutinized, and such scrutiny quite alters first impressions. So let us move in with a hand lens and be fussy about 4 points in particular. Point 1. There is a system common to all life on Earth, not just a set of molecules. The unity of biochemistry applies, for example, to the ribosome technique of protein synthesis, to the idea of using proteins for catalysts, and of making membranes from proteins and lipids. It applies too to more particular manufacturing procedures, to the sequencing of operations in the making and breaking of molecules. These central metabolic pathways are extraordinarily similar in all forms of life that we know of, and their more detailed structure is very revealing, but we will leave this further analysis until the next chapter. Now, it is quite clear that the universality of all this higher-order organization cannot be accounted for in terms of the pre-existence of precisely this organization on a lifeless Earth. I don't think that anyone has suggested that the ribosome was picked out of a probiotic soup. That being so, it becomes correspondingly less clear which, if any, of the component molecules might have been pre-selected. At least some of the universality was an evolutionary product. The thought arises, perhaps it all was. But surely, you might say, you need the parts before you can make a machine. The molecules of life must have been there before life, before the system could start to be built up. Is this not common sense? Common sense? Well, perhaps it is. But it is a confusion. It is a false intuition based on what we think would have been a sensible procedure. We may make a machine by first designing it, then drawing up a list of components that will be needed, then acquiring the components, and then building the machine. But that can never be the way that evolution works. It has no plan. It has no view of the finished system. It would not know in advance which pieces would be relevant. Even if amino acids, for example, had been in a probiotic soup, what use would they have been long before their key use now, to make protein, had been hit on? It is the whole machine that makes sense of its components. Point 2. Subsystems are highly interlocked within the universal system. For example, proteins are needed to make catalysts, yet catalysts are needed to make proteins. Nucleic acids are needed to make proteins, yet proteins are needed to make nucleic acids. Proteins and lipids are needed to make membranes, yet membranes are needed to provide protection for all the chemical processes going on in a cell. It goes on and on. The manufacturing procedures for key small molecules are highly interdependent. Again and again, this has to be made before that can be made, but that had to be there already. The whole is presupposed by all the parts. The interlocking is tight and critical. At the center, everything depends on everything. Then there are 4 subsidiary points. A. It is no surprise that our central biochemical machinery is now so conservative. When everything depends on everything, it is difficult for anything to be changed. B. Such a multiple interlocking of functions could only have been a product of evolution. The center of our system then became fixed, but it could not have been fixed to begin with. C. This strong dependence of subsystems on each other is understandable as an evolutionary product in that it is typical of efficient pieces of machinery. A motor car, a clock, a television set, an oboe, a refrigerator, a tennis racket. Think of almost any sophisticated piece of engineering and you will find more or less diverse components, of little use by themselves, working in collaboration. D. Less clear is how a gradual step-by-step evolution can lead to a system in which everything depends on everything. Chapter 8 will be a more detailed investigation of point 2. The puzzling subsidiary point D will prove to be particularly helpful. Point 3. The common system is very, very complex, quite apart from the interlocking nature of that complexity. It was, then, the product of an extended evolution. It is far, in evolutionary terms, from the original organisms. Point 4. There are conventions in the universal system, features that could easily have been otherwise. The exact choice of the amino acid alphabet and the set of assignments of amino acid letters to nucleic acid words, the genetic code, are examples. A particularly clear case is in the universal choice of only left-handed amino acids for making proteins, when, as far as one can see, right-handed ones would have been just as good. Let me clarify this. Molecules that are at all complex are usually not superposable on their mirror images. There is nothing particularly strange about this. It is true of most objects. Your right hand, for example, is a left hand in the mirror. It is only rather symmetrical objects that do not have right-handed or left-handed versions. When two or more objects have to be fitted together in some way, their handedness begins to matter. If it is a left hand, it must go with a left glove. If a nut has a right-hand screw, then so must its bolt. In the same sort of way, the socket on an enzyme will generally be fussy about the handedness of a molecule that is to fit it. If the socket is left-handed, then only the left-handed molecule will do. So there has to be this kind of discrimination in biochemistry, as in human engineering, when right-handed and left-handed objects are being dealt with. And it is perhaps not surprising that the amino acids for proteins should have a uniform handedness. There could be a good reason for that, as there is a good reason to stick to only one-handedness for nuts and bolts. But whether in such cases to choose left or right, that is pure convention. It could be decided by the toss of a coin. It is one of the most singular features of the unity of biochemistry that this mere convention is universal. Where did such agreement come from? You see, non-biological processes do not as a rule show any bias one way or the other, and it has proved particularly difficult to see any realistic way in which any of the constituents of a probiotic soup would have been predominantly left-handed or right-handed molecules. It is thus particularly difficult to see this feature as having been imposed by initial conditions. Here again it would seem that the convention to be right-handed or left-handed was arrived at concomitantly with the evolution of the whole complex system. Looked at this way, the problem of where the handedness convention came from is all part of the same problem as every other manifestation of the unity of biochemistry, and there is a classical Darwinian explanation, then, that stares us in the face. Descent from a common ancestor is a frequent explanation for common features in different species of organism. All mammals have hair because the single species from which cows, rabbits, whales, people, bats, etc. evolved was hairy, and because hair had become a fixed characteristic by this time this common ancestor appeared. Sometimes one can be misled. The wings of the bird and the beetle were discovered independently. They are not to be explained in terms of common ancestry, so one has to be careful. But where a feature is functionally not critical, where it appears to be a mere convention, where it could very well have been otherwise, then one is on stronger ground. If there are many shared characteristics of this sort, then one is on very strong ground. That there are many conventional aspects of our central biochemistry allows us to assert with some confidence what is a very widely held view, that the unity of biochemistry arises because all organisms on Earth are descended from a single common ancestor within which certain features had already been fixed. Of course, the fixed features referred to are precisely those features that constitute the unity of biochemistry. We might surmise from point 2 that these features became fixed through interlocking of functions. In any case, from point 3, this last common ancestor of all life on the earth was already highly evolved. Its fixed conventions were to be passed on eventually to all living forms on the earth. As for that decision between left-handed or right-handed amino acids, I dare say there had been many tossings of that coin and many different decisions. But because all life now is descended from a single common ancestor, it was only one tossing of the coin that was to be remembered. The logic of Darwin's tree makes the lateness of the last common ancestor readily understandable. Given that new species can only arise from pre-existing species through branching processes, and given also that the vast majority of species become extinct, then it becomes virtually inevitable that after a sufficient time all living species will be traceable to some point well above the initial branch point. Darwin's tree, you see, is something like this. You can try drawing such a tree yourself, branching at random, pruning at random, and you will see that this is the usual sort of outcome. All the topmost twigs, corresponding to here and now organisms, are connected to some main branch point well above the ground. If there is an apparent absence of really primitive forms of life on the earth, this is not because there never were such forms. It is not even mainly that primitive forms would find the competition too hard, although I dare say they might. No, a sufficient reason is already there in the logic of the sort of tree that Darwin described, where branching and pruning and branching and pruning have been going on together. Why are some molecules of life easy to make? There is a growing doubt about the idea that the primitive oceans would have been full of organic molecules. As discussed in Chapter 1, it seems now that the early atmosphere of the Earth was dominated by nitrogen and carbon dioxide. This would have made the synthesis of organic molecules much more difficult than under the methane-dominated atmosphere that had previously been imagined. It is being realized, too, that ultraviolet sunlight is even better at destroying middle-sized organic molecules than at making them. A general effect of ultraviolet light is to break covalent bonds. While this will tend to lead to the making of a wider spread of molecules, because the broken bonds will reform in new ways, the general effect is nevertheless destructive. It is an atom shuffling effect. The typical outcome is either a very complicated mixture, a tar, or simple, rather stable molecules like carbon dioxide and water, or, very often, first the one and then the other. The remote-controlled landings on Mars by the Viking spacecraft serve to emphasize the bleak side of ultraviolet sunlight from the point of view of chemical evolution. There are seemingly no organic molecules on the surface of Mars because of the ultraviolet light. Indeed, organic molecules are destroyed before they are made. The ultraviolet sunlight converts surface minerals into materials that will destroy organic molecules even more effectively than will oxygen gas. Even without ultraviolet light or oxygen, mixtures of organic molecules do not keep very well. Vintage port in its cold, dark cellar changes over mere decades. Complex mineral surfaces can have accidental catalytic effects that tend to accelerate the arbitrary shuffling of covalent bonds, leading to more and more complex tars. If you want an example of how the Earth processes organic molecules, then look at raw petroleum. Organic minerals are usually exceedingly complex shuffled-up mixtures of this sort. If indeed those active, wound-up little molecules, cyanide and formaldehyde, have been present in primitive oceans, they would have made matters worse. True, they are kicked into existence from more stable materials by various energy sources, and if you have them pure, they will need no further pushing to make a few of the simpler molecules of life for you, as well as many other things. But the waters on the primitive Earth would not have been pure. There would have been millions of kinds of organic molecules there if there had been any kinds at all. There would have been millions of ways for cyanide or formaldehyde to react. The result would have been a thicker, darker sort of tar. Organic chemists are only too familiar with tars, gludges, and gunks. Infernally complicated mixtures are only two normal products of organic chemical reactions. It is the sheer richness of ways of putting together carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen atoms that creates the problem. There has to be much contrivance and control if any particular molecule of any great complexity is to be made in more than the minutest amounts. Even then, complicated mixtures are seldom avoided entirely. Most of the hard work is in the synthesis of a particular organic compound, is worker-up. This is a kind of weeding operation. After a reaction has taken place, in which molecules that you did not want are removed. To synthesize a molecule of any complexity usually requires many reactions in a row, with careful work-up at each step, because, generally speaking, the product from one reaction should be pure before the next step is taken. It is true that some of the simpler amino acids have been found in complex mixtures generated under conditions simulating those that might have been present on the primitive Earth. Even nucleotide letters have been found in mixtures that are said to be plausible simulations of probiotic products. But all such molecules of life are always minority products and usually no more than trace products. Their detection often owes more to the skill of the experimenter than to any powerful tendency for the molecules to form. Sugars are particularly trying. While it is true that they form from formaldehyde solutions, these solutions have to be far more concentrated than would have been likely in primordial oceans. And the reaction is quite spoilt in the practice by just about every possible sugar being made at the same time, and much else besides. Furthermore, the conditions that form sugars also go on to destroy them. Sugars quickly make their own special kind of tar, caramel, and they make still more complicated mixtures if amino acids are around. In sum, the ease of synthesis of the molecules of life has been greatly exaggerated. It only applies to a few of the simplest, and in no case is it at all easy to see how the molecules would have been sufficiently unencumbered by other irrelevant or interfering molecules that have allowed further organization to higher order structures of the kinds that would be needed. Message tapes, selective control structures, etc. Finally, even if I am wrong about all this and primitive geochemistry had shown a precision of organic reaction control quite unlike modern geochemistry, even if it had produced all the molecules of life and nothing but the molecules of life in ample amounts, even then it would still have only reached the edges of the real problem as outlined in the first 4 chapters. Still, somehow an evolving machine had to be made. But you might say, there is something here that needs explaining. It is surely not a coincidence that sugars do form formaldehyde, that adenine does form from cyanide, that amino acids are made preferentially in simulated thunderstorms, and that they turn up in meteorites. Can we not still say that there is something especially ubiquitous about at least some of the molecules of life? They turn up all over the place. Yes, indeed, but let's get these things in perspective. Here are the brutal facts as they now appear to us. 1. Only some molecules of life are ubiquitous. 2. Most ubiquitous molecules are not molecules of life. 3. Molecules of life are usually better made under conditions other than those characteristic of the early Earth. The correct inference is that some classes of organic molecules are easier to make and/or more stable than others, and that our highly evolved biochemical machine incorporates a number of members of such classes. This is simply not surprising enough to be informative. It is not surprising that the set of molecules that was eventually to be fixed in our biochemical system should have included some that were not too difficult to make and reasonably stable once made. That would have been good economical engineering, an understandable outcome in any case, whether such molecules had been prerequisites for or products of that early phase of evolution that established our central biochemistry. What is much more significant, I think, is that nucleotides and lipids, which are crucial to our present system, are absent from the class of ubiquitous molecules. Nucleotides and lipids have yet to be made under conditions that are realistic simulations of primitive Earth conditions. Nucleotides and lipids are much too complicated and particular for this to be surprising. They have all the appearance of molecules specially contrived for particular purposes. They have all the appearance of being, specifically, products of early evolution, not prerequisites. Perhaps you still feel that time and more time and the resource of oceans could have overcome the problems of how the more complex molecules of life were originally made. I will now try to dispel such optimism by considering in more detail the most critical of all the molecules of life. Nucleotides are too expensive. The Sigma Company is one of the several that compete to supply biochemicals for research purposes. Looking through their catalogue, I find that I can buy a gram of ATP, a primed, wound-up RNA nucleotide, for about £5. ATP is only as cheap as this because it is relatively easy to extract from bulk biological materials, horse meat to be more specific. The other 3 primed RNA nucleotides are about 10 times the price, and the primed DNA nucleotides cost about £300 per gram. But even these are only as cheap as they are because they are derived from natural biological materials. As with postage stamps, the price of nucleotides rises steeply with more abnormal types. The version of ATP with the sugar arabinose in the connector piece in place of ribose comes in at about £6,000 a gram. But even such abnormal nucleotides, if they are synthetic, man-made, at all, are never wholly synthetic. Their manufacture will have started with components such as ribose, obtained from biological sources. Usually the letter piece too will have been got that way. So £6,000 a gram, or if you prefer 6m pounds a kilogram, is a low estimate for the cost of a primed nucleotide in the open universe, as it were. What would these materials cost if it were not for the horses and others that do most of the hard work? What would it actually cost to manufacture primed nucleotides from methane, ammonia, and phosphate rock? I hate to think. Contrast glycine and alanine, the 2 simplest amino acids. These really can be said to be easily made. They have been detected frequently in complex mixtures from sparking experiments in meteorites, etc. Glycine comes in at about 1p a gram, and alanine as a mixture of left-handed and right-handed forms about 8p. I may say that at these prices you get 99% pure material. Thunderstorm simulations give you 99% impure material. Not only are they difficult to make, but primed nucleotides are rather unstable. Sigma recommend that the DNA prime nucleotide should be shipped in dry ice to avoid decomposition in transit, and nucleotides generally should be stored at below freezing point. Expensive and fragile primed nucleotides, or unprimed ones for that matter, are, I think, implausible as significant geochemical products, as minerals, at any time. In Genetic Takeover, I listed 14 major hurdles that would have to be overcome for primed nucleotides to have been made on the primitive Earth. From the build-up of sufficient and separate concentrations of formaldehyde and cyanide to the final winding up of the nucleotides. In practice, each of these processes would be subdivided into separate unit operations that would have to be suitably sequenced. In carrying out an organic synthesis in the laboratory, there are tens or hundreds of little events, lifting, pouring, mixing, stirring, topping up, decanting, adjusting, etc., etc. There may not be much to these unit operations in themselves, but their sequencing has to be right. There is a manufacturing procedure that has to be followed, and when such a procedure is at all prolonged, it becomes absurd to imagine it being carried out by chance. That is why simple amino acids are plausible probiotic products, primed nucleotides are not. It is not that one cannot imagine plausible unit processes on the primitive Earth that, taken together, might have yielded primed nucleotides as one can imagine a coin falling heads 1,000 times in a row. Yes, you can imagine the primitive Earth doing the kinds of things that the practical organic chemist does. You can see a pool evaporating in the sun to concentrate a solution, or two solutions happening to mix because a stream overflows, or a catalytic mineral dust being blown in by the wind. You can imagine filtrations, decantations, heatings, acidifications. You can imagine many such operations taking place through little geological and meteorological accidents. But to show that each step is a sequence is plausible is not to show that the sequence itself is plausible. But, you may say, with all the time in the world and so much world, the right combinations of circumstances would happen sometime. Is that not plausible? The answer is no. There was not enough time, and there was not enough world. Let me try to justify this. It would be a safe oversimplification, I think, to say that on average the 14 hurdles that I referred to in the making of primed nucleotides would each take 10 unit operations. At least 140 little events would have to be appropriately sequenced. If you doubt this, go and watch an organic chemist at work. Look at all the things he actually does in bringing about what he would describe as one step in an organic synthesis. And it is surely on the optimistic side to suppose that, unguided, the appropriate thing happened at each point on one occasion in 6. But if we take this as a kind of chance that we are talking about, then we can say that the odds against a successful unguided synthesis of a batch of primed nucleotide on the primitive Earth are similar to the odds against a 6 coming up every time with 140 throws of a dice. Is that sort of thing too much of a coincidence or not? There are 6 possible outcomes from throwing a dice once. 6 times 6 for a double throw, 6 times 6 times 6 for a triple throw, and 6 multiplied by itself 140 times from 140 throws. This is a huge number, represented approximately by a 1 followed by 109 zeros. That's 10 to the power of 109. This is the sort of number of trials that you would have to make to have a reasonable chance of hitting on the one outcome that represents success. Throwing one dice once a second for the period of the Earth's history would only let you get through about 10 to the power of 15 trials. So you would need about 10 to the power of 94 dice. That is far more than the number of electrons in the observed universe, estimated at around 10 to the power of 80. Of course, you might argue that in practice a synthesis might be carried through in different ways, and that is true, but remember what generous allowances we made in cutting down the actual number of sheer skill that organic synthesis requires. And remember too that a manufacturing procedure is not usually very forgiving about arbitrary modifications. it all too easily goes off the rails, never to recover. This is especially true of chemical processes, where it is usually not enough to add the acid at the wrong time, or throw away the wrong solution, or even use an ultraviolet lamp of the wrong sort. Careless organic synthesis only works when the product that is wanted belongs to that inevitably small set of molecules that are especially stable, molecules like carbon dioxide and water, even perhaps glycine and adenine in a much more limited way. But nucleotides are not like that to judge from the price. One's intuition can lead one astray when thinking about the role of vast times and spaces in generating improbable structures. The moral is that vast times and spaces do not make all that much difference to the level of competence that pure chance can simulate. Even to get 14 sixes in a row, with one dice following the rules of our game, you should put aside some tens of thousands of years. But for 7 sixes, a few weeks should do, and for 3 sixes, a few minutes. This is all an indication of the steepness of that cliff face that we were thinking about. A 3-step process may be easily attributable to chance, while a similar 30-step process is quite absurd. Dicing with life. Intuitively, one might have supposed that a 30-step process would take about 10 times as long to be realized by chance as a 3-step process. There are situations in which this would be the case, but only when there is a memory of success and failure in the past, where success can be built on. The dice-throwing analogy here is where we are allowed to continue throwing at each step until a 6 comes up, and then go on to the next step, where we can accumulate the successes. That way, 146s could be reached with one dice in about 140 times 6 seconds, or about a quarter of an hour. But that kind of dice game only becomes possible in nature, where there are successions of organisms, where messages are being handed on, where a design is not spoilt by a single failure, where past success can still be built on in spite of failures, because there are many copies of the past success in existence. It is then that biology begins. Dicing with organisms is a different game altogether. But how did nature start to play this game? At the very least, a maintained supply of primed nucleotides would be required for any kind of organism using our kind of message tapes. A nucleotide-making factory would be needed. Surely only natural selection could have generated such a thing in the first place. Surely then, there were earlier organisms that did not need nucleotides, but could evolve to produce them. The way to surmount that cliff face is to avoid it. There must be some other path to the mountain. The odds are enormous against its being coincidence. No figures could express them.